Hello everyone, welcome to the series summarizing the novel Lord of the Mysteries on the AniMonolith channel. In the previous part, Klein attends a spirit mirror class by Hans Vincent. Klein reflects on his growing knowledge of divination and mysticism, noting the three types of divination based on the source of the hint. Throughout the lecture, Klein remains observant and cautious, ensuring nothing dangerous or extraordinary is involved. After the class, Klein contemplates ways to promote himself as a seer but decides against it. Meanwhile, Edward Steve, another club member, chats with his colleague Glassy, who shares his past struggles with illness and recovery thanks to a skilled pharmacist. When Angelica mentions Klein, Glassy expresses excitement about meeting him again, praising Klein as a miraculous person with abilities akin to a doctor. This piques Edward's curiosity about Klein, further establishing Klein's growing reputation in the club. After leaving the divination club, Klein returned home just in time for dinner with his family. During the meal, Benson asked why Klein, as a consultant, had to leave for work so early. Klein responded calmly, explaining that a stack of historical documents needed to be delivered to Backlund without delay. He mentioned that he had to oversee the inventory personally to ensure nothing was overlooked. After all, he added, the clients have no understanding of ancient Fasak. Thanks to Klein's reasonable explanation, Benson no longer had any doubts about the matter. Klein then seized the opportunity to provide some spending money for Benson and Melissa. Faced with a large sum of money, Benson and Melissa were surprised but did not suspect that Klein was involved in any illegal activities. They completely trusted Klein, partly because he was an honest and kind person. However, Benson and Melissa seemed reluctant to accept too much money from Klein because they wanted him to save for himself. But Klein persuaded them that his current job needed to be expedited, and he played an important role, so the £5 was just an advance. The payment after resolving everything would be no less. In light of Klein's insistence, Benson ultimately decided to use these £5 to invest in buying books to prepare for advancement. Hearing his brother's intentions, Klein was very pleased and immediately led him to study more about state administration. After all, the civil service exam in the Kingdom of Loan might be coming soon, so the earlier Benson prepared, the better his chances of passing the exam. Alongside encouraging his brother Benson's future career, Klein also paid attention to his sister Melissa. He reminded her to remember to buy some new dresses. When Melissa refused, Klein skillfully mentioned Selena's upcoming birthday party, to which Melissa would be invited. Hearing this, Melissa no longer opposed it, as Selena would, her schoolmate and good friend, came from a well-off family. Selena's brother is a legal advisor, and her father has been a long-time employee at the Tingen branch of the Backlund Bank. However, what the Wood family referred to as a banquet was simply inviting friends over for dinner, chatting, or playing cards. As the conversation was revolving around Selena's upcoming party, Melissa suddenly mentioned that Mrs. Shade, their neighbor, had sent the maid over with an invitation and scheduled to visit the Moretti family for a semi-official introduction to the new neighbors on Sunday at 4 p.m. tomorrow. Upon hearing Mrs. Shade's name, Benson murmured thoughtfully, "Is she the one from 4 Water Lily Street? I've met her husband before, he's been a legal advisor for many years." After hearing the information from his brother and sister, Klein nodded thoughtfully. He agreed that meeting the neighbors was important but mentioned he had to work on Sundays and wouldn't be free until Monday. He then asked Melissa to apologize to Mrs. Shade for him. Klein couldn't help but ponder the phrase semi-official neighbor introductions that Melissa had mentioned. Noticing his brother's confusion, Benson quickly explained, families with annual incomes ranging from £100 to £1,000 are considered middle class. They are often praised by the press, particularly in magazines for families and ladies, for not being as arrogant as the nobility and wealthy, nor as coarse as the lower class. These magazines simplify many of the social rituals of the nobility, viewing them as signs of the middle class. Informal visits, semi-official visits, and formal visits all originate from this. At this point, Benson suddenly laughed and said, "Gentlemen and ladies who consider themselves part of this class pay great attention to similar details. They usually visit neighbors and friends between 2 p.m. and 6 p.m., calling it early afternoon visiting." Hearing this, both Klein and Melissa were very surprised, as visiting at 2 p.m. and 6 p.m. was called early afternoon visiting. However, Benson couldn't explain this absurdity either, but he speculated that the ladies had probably been busy dressing for the morning mass and then visited in the afternoon, hence the more formal name. The next morning, which was Sunday, Klein went to Blackthorn Company for work as usual. He ran into Roseanne, who had just finished her night shift and was on her way back to her resting room. Then he saw Royale Radine, a member of the Nighthawks. She was a sleepless, appearing quite indifferent, with long, thin eyelashes, relatively large eyes, and black, silky hair. Klein greeted Royale, and she replied somewhat dismissively. However, as they brushed past each other, Royale suddenly said, "The magic ritual is a very dangerous practice." Although surprised by Royale's warning, Klein didn't forget his purpose for seeking old Neil to study mysticism. He quickly found old Neil, who was on duty in the armory, and Brett, who shouldn't have been there. Noticing Klein's confusion, Neil suggested they go to his house. He explained that he had gathered the necessary materials and that Brett was overseeing the armory, which lacked the space for the magic ritual. Klein didn't ask many questions and followed Neil back to the surface. Then they took a public carriage to the northern suburbs. Old Neil's house was a row house, with rose bushes and mint planted in front. Upon entering, there was a carpeted porch. Inside were 2 rows of high-backed chairs and a stand for umbrellas. Beyond the porch was a spacious living room with light-colored wallpaper and dark brown flooring. In the center was a rug with small patterns and a rather heavy round table. Surrounding the round table were benches, armchairs, and a piano. Old Neil briefly introduced that the piano once belonged to his deceased wife. Hearing this, Klein appeared awkward, but Neil didn't place much importance on it. He decided to let Klein practice the ritual in the living room. Of course, old Neil would demonstrate for Klein to observe and imitate. He took a piece of faux leather paper from a small chest and used a special black ink with a scent of tranquility to draw strange patterns on it. Klein noticed that Neil seemed to be drawing an invoice. When Neil filled in the words 30 and the symbol 4 pounds in the corresponding positions, Klein couldn't help but be curious and asked Neil what magical ritual they planned to perform. Upon hearing this, old Neil's face briefly showed confusion, and he explained that he would use a magical ritual to settle a debt of 30 pounds owed in the black market. Klein was astonished by old Neil's answer and wondered if Neil intended to engage in illegal activities, such as cursing the creditor or creating counterfeit money. Sensing Klein's thoughts, old Neil, irritated, clarified his position. He stressed that do as you wish but do no harm, referencing a principle from the mysterious Morse sect. He explained that Beyonders who followed this rule had proven its accuracy, as it helped minimize the risk of losing control. Any deviation from it, he warned, would have the opposite effect. Realizing he had offended Neil, Klein quickly apologized, and Neil's anger subsided. Old Neil then looked at Klein intently and expressed regret that there was no suitable maxim for a seer, as there were indeed very few Beyonders who chose this type of potion. Neil quickly took out the tools from the silver chest he had brought from Blackthorn Company to prepare for the upcoming ritual. Old Neil pulled out the reddest and blackest candles from the silver chest, explaining that while ordinary people must rely on astrology or handbooks to choose the right time for a magical ritual, Beyonders can depend on strong spiritual and astral projections. His tone shifted to a more serious one as he warned Klein that low-sequence Beyonders lack enough power and often need to invoke external forces for their rituals. He stressed the importance of only appealing to orthodox deities, like the Evernight Goddess or the Lord of Storms, and never approaching unidentified entities, regardless of whether they have believers, worshippers, or make enticing promises. Under old Neil's stern guidance, Klein vowed to remember this lesson well. However, Klein felt quite confused because the fortune-changing ritual he had performed on Earth might have inadvertently invoked something unknown. That was likely why he was ice-skied into this world, taking on the role of the original Klein and possessing extraordinary power, the kind of power that could make the Hanged Man, a longtime Beyonder, feel reverence, not to mention the fact that he had pulled 2 mysterious individuals of high status into the fog. Though somewhat anxious, Klein still felt that things weren't too terrible, as he hadn't lost control yet. To alleviate his worries about having possibly offended something he shouldn't have touched, Klein asked old Neil whether, as an unofficial member of the Nighthawks, he should invoke the Evernight Goddess to grant him power. However, Neil humorously replied that Klein could also invoke the Lord of Storms, but it was uncertain whether God would respond, or if so, whether the response would be malevolent, distorting the outcome of Klein's magical ritual in unpredictable ways. Klein continued to observe old Neil's actions as he placed 2 candles, one red and one black, into designated positions. At this point, Neil also proactively mentioned the significance of this action. Why are there only 2 candles representing the goddess, when the goddess is the mother of mystery, the queen of fear and calamity, the lord of silence and peaceful sleep? This emphasizes her duality as both a nurturing and terrifying figure. This is because, before their fall, the Morse sect had a good relationship with the Church, and some of their concepts about magical rituals deeply influenced the Church of the Evernight Goddess. The Morse sect believed that everything has a number, and each number has its own spiritual essence. In magical rituals, the number 0 represents the unknown, chaos, and the state before the world was created. The number 1 signifies the beginning, representing the Creator. The number 2 symbolizes the world and the deities born from the body of the god. The number 3 represents the interaction between the divine and the material, where everything takes shape. Therefore, using 2 candles symbolizes the goddess, while the third candle is for us. The specific types of candles used should depend on the effects of the magical ritual one wishes to achieve. Upon hearing this, Klein suddenly recalled the concept of the 3 births and 10,000 things on earth. This is a philosophical concept from Chinese thought, particularly Taoism, representing the creation and existence of all things in the universe, including heaven, earth, and humanity. Noticing Klein's attentive demeanor, old Neil continued to perform the operations with great care. Of course, he didn't forget to clearly explain to Klein, for beyonders who are not familiar with magical rituals, auxiliary items such as bells, crystal balls, silver cups, and incense are required. However, for mystery priors and seers, only a few items like candles, full moon essential oil, a pot engraved with the dark sacred emblem, a small silver knife with intricate patterns, a glass of clear water, and a plate of coarse salt are needed. After completing what seemed to be a simple operation, old Neil turned to look intently at Klein and seriously said, "The method for performing magical rituals begins with entering a state of cogitation, focusing the mind, and then using auxiliary items to guide one's power outward, forming a barrier around oneself. This is similar to the time I used holy powder at Ray Bieber's house." At this point, Klein immediately remembered the sensation of an insurmountable barrier around Neil when he was sketching Ray Bieber at Captain Dunn's request. Then old Neil continued his lecture. Throughout the entire process, the practitioner must determine the symbolic sigils and corresponding incantations based on the desired outcome. Regarding incantations, it's best to use the language of Hermes, as ancient Hermes originates from nature, similar to ancient dragon language and ancient elemental languages. Its effects are very direct. However, the downside is that it lacks the necessary secrecy and protection, making it easy for the user to fall into danger. This is also why it has been modified, although it is much more effective. After that, Neil entered a state completely different from his initial demeanor. Particularly, Neil's eyes darkened, and an invisible barrier seemed to appear around him. Old Neil then recited a passage from ancient Hermes and skillfully carried out the remaining steps of the ritual. He stood before the round table, placed the silver knife down, took the full moon essential oil, and dripped 3 drops onto the black candle, the red candle, and a regular candle. At that moment, a fog enveloped the area, making everything appear mystical. Neil then picked up a quill and wrote out the sigils, a square encompassing the entire content signifying his control over the debt on the faux leather paper. He then drew a cross to signify that the debt was settled. At this point, he held the faux leather paper in one hand and gently tapped his glabella with the other to open his spirit vision, immediately entering a powerful state. Once stabilized, Neil continued to read a short passage in ancient Hermes. "I beseech the power of darkness, I beseech the power of red, I beseech the favor of the goddess, please grant me the money to pay off this debt. Nightshade, herb of the red moon, please lend your strength to my incantation." Hearing old Neil's invocation, Klein was quite surprised at how simple the wording was. It was not as elaborate or complex as he had imagined. While Klein was still pondering whether old Neil's debt-clearing ritual would be accepted by the goddess, suddenly, the light of the candle flared brightly. After Neil finished reading, he closed his eyes for 2 minutes, then took the full moon essential oil and dripped a drop onto each of the 3 candles. Immediately after, he held the faux leather paper close to the candle representing I. When the paper caught fire, he swiftly tossed it into the pot. He then closed his eyes again, as if feeling the paper burning. Afterward, Neil informed Klein that the debt issue would be resolved, of course, not through illegal means, but he did not know how it would happen. In response to old Neil's answer, Klein suddenly felt deeply skeptical about the authenticity of the magical ritual that had just taken place.